Okay, que haber everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Boirun. Bienvenidos a todos. As we say in Ladino, hope everyone is having a wonderful evening. If you're on the East Coast, a good afternoon. If you're on the West Coast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I'm the managing director of La Hermandad Sephardic de America, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic community of the United States. And we're so excited to have here tonight wonderful author Josh Tuininga, who is an amazing new author, not new, I should say, but amazing author and new to our community for his new book, We Are Not Strangers, a new Sephardic graphic novel, which is going to be talking about this evening. Just as a reminder, you can find all our previous classes that we've done and will continue to do on our website. If you go to sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy, you can also go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sephardic Brotherhood, or YouTube channel, youtube.com/Sephardic Brotherhood, to catch any previous programs or this program later on if you'd like to rewatch it again or share it with friends. So a little bit about our speaker tonight. Josh is an author, an artist, and a graphic designer based in the North Bend, Washington State. A graduate of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Josh's artistic career has explored a variety of mediums, including sequential art, animation, painting, and design. In 2003, he founded an art plus design agency, The Medium, where he continues to work as creative director. Josh is the author of We Are Not Strangers, Abrams Comic Arts 2023 Publishing, and two children's books, Why Blue and Dream On. He also makes music with his wife as To the River. You can find information about other events and classes all on his website as well. Without further ado, I'm going to have it over to Josh for a wonderful presentation about his new book.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Really appreciate it. Really happy to be here to share this story with the Sephardic Brotherhood of America community. This is awesome. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. So let me see here. Let's make sure I'm sharing my screen. And it should work. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm here to talk about oh, sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. There we go. My first graphic novel, We Are Not Strangers. Um, this story started with the story that my uncle told me about visiting his uncle's funeral. And when he got there, he was telling me the story about started telling me the story about his Papoo, who is a Sephardic Jewish immigrant from Turkey who arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. And Marco, my uncle, went on to tell me about attending his Papu's funeral. And it was a typical Sephardic Jewish event, close family, friends, relatives he hadn't seen in years, tons of familiar faces. But there were some people he didn't recognize at all. A handful of Japanese American guests began to arrive, and nobody knew who they were or why they came. And what Marco found out is that his Papu had helped these families when they were forced out of the neighborhood and incarcerated during World War II. So his story only took a couple minutes to tell me, but for the next few days, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I was just, asking myself, how does a Jewish immigrant with family still overseas threatened by the Holocaust end up helping out his Japanese American neighbors here at home? Did they stay in touch after the war? Were there other similar stories like this? So I had a ton of questions. So I went back to interview my uncle. This is a drawing of him. And together we started to do some research to see if we could find out more about the story. We were talking to our families and people from the old neighborhood to see if we can dig up some details about what happened. And I knew that Marco was named after his Papu, Marco Calvo, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant. And his Papu had spent the beginning of his life on the small fishing island of Marmara. But the region was becoming really unstable for Jews at the time. And so Marco and a lot of other Sephardic Jews came to America in hopes of a better life, many of them arriving here in the Pacific Northwest. And so I went into the Ellis Island immigration database and I found his official immigration documents from when Marco Calvo immigrated to Seattle in 1920. And we knew that when he was young, he lived in the Central District and worked at Pike Place Market, which at the time were primarily Japanese and Jewish owned. We knew that Marco owned and ran the Ferry Dock Tavern, and we talked to a lot of people who remembered him. So we were digging up all kinds of vague details, but we weren't getting that far with information. Seattle had changed a lot since the 40s, and most of the people who would have any information about this story had died a long time ago. But I kept asking around, and I kept hearing this name pop in conversations. Probably a name that many of you probably have heard. Kept hearing, have you talked to Devin Narr? You got to go see Professor Narr at University of Washington. So I looked up Devin, who is the professor of Sephardic Studies at University of Washington. And so I decided to reach out to him and see if he had any advice. And he agreed to meet up on University of Washington campus. And that first meeting is when I realized that this project was about much more than just some family folklore. Professor Narr started talking about the parallels between the Sephardic Jewish and the Japanese cultures and the communities in Seattle. And I started to learn about the Seattle Central District in particular, the neighborhood where immigrants and minorities who were blocked from living elsewhere could kind of call their home. And so that first meeting, Devin gave me a ton of resources, gave me a ton of homework, and and that's kind of where this story kind of really started to solidify. Um, Devin showed me these maps of the Seattle Central District, which highlights just kind of how unique of an area this was. Um, these maps are based on a house-to-house survey conducted in 1939, and you can see how there's concentrated neighborhoods, Sephardic Jews, Japanese, and so there's these pockets where kind of people live, but they all over kind of overlapped each other. And so yeah, people of different backgrounds kind of living right up against each other in this community. So I'm just going to take a quick second to talk about Sephardic Jews. I've been doing this talk quite a bit over the last few months, and most people don't have any idea there are different Jewish cultures. But I'll do it quickly here because I'm sure everybody knows this information. But in the book, most people when they think of Jewish culture, they think of matzo ball soup, speaking Yiddish, Ashkenazic Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. But Sephardic Jews, as we know, come from Spain, Portugal, and the Middle East. And I was really excited about representing this in my story because, I hadn't seen a character represented like that, especially in a comic book. And so the main character of the story is based on my family history, Sephardic Jews from the Mediterranean, fishing islands. And, when the main character arrives here in America, the U.S. immigration authorities don't really know what to make of this newcomer. Um, Sephardic Jews arrived in the United States were unlike the other 2 million Jews who were arriving from Eastern Europe at the time. They didn't speak Yiddish. Many of them didn't look like the typical European Jews that they were accustomed to seeing. But as the Sephardic Jewish immigrants continued to arrive in America, they settled in cities all over. And Seattle became one of the second largest communities of Sephardic Jews in the United States. And a lot of Sephardic Jews who immigrated to Seattle found opportunities in the fish markets at Pike Place. And so, yeah, the market, it was celebrated as the soul of Seattle, and many of the community called it the secular synagogue. So the National Register of Historic Places identifies Sephardic Jews as a key demographic in the history. And so it's a really great opportunity for immigrants who knew how to fish, which, was the same for the Japanese community. And so it's estimated that as 4/5 of the fishermen and farmers selling produce at the time were Japanese Americans. So I was learning about this strong connection. The fishing, scenes became a really tight bond for my characters. And as I mentioned before, these communities lived in the Central District, which I really wanted to highlight. This was it had the nickname Little Jerusalem at the time for Jewish people, and came the home to some of the first Sephardic synagogues in the country. But it was also the location of Nihon Machi, which is the Japantown, which kind of emerged there. And yeah, so I started to dive deeper into this area. I started to think about my own memories from the Central District. When I was a kid, we lived in the suburbs, but my papa would take me into the city all the time to run errands. And he loved to take me through the old neighborhoods, tell me old stories of growing up in the CD. And we'd usually take a detour, grab some fish at the fish markets or some hambao at one of the markets. And, wherever we went, he always seemed to know everybody. And as a kid, I never really understood quite why we had to drive all the way into the city just to pick up, some salmon for Passover or go to the bank even. But as a kid, but looking back, I think it's pretty clear he wanted to stay connected with that community. He was from a family of Jewish immigrants. Most of his family overseas had been, wiped out during the Holocaust, and Central District was a place full of people with similar backgrounds, and he felt really comfortable there. So when I started this project, my papa wasn't around anymore, but I decided to do exactly what we used to do together. So I jumped in my car and headed to the city and started doing some exploring. And I also started doing some drawing. So here's my first sketch of the original Sephardic Bikur Cholim synagogue in the Central District. And I can kind of come through some of these other landmarks. This was the Ferry Dock Tavern, which Marco Calvo owned, and which became kind of the setting of a lot of my scenes. And yeah, I just kind of immersed myself in these environments. I could kind of put historical landmarks in the background. This is Washington Hall, which was a historic public dance and music hall, which was the gathering place and settlement house for a lot of immigrant cultures. And yeah, so I use a lot of reference material to create my characters and my scenes, as you can see here. And I started using some of the information I was learning about where our family came from in the artwork. I also used a lot of newspaper headlines to set the time frame of the story. And yeah, I use a lot of reference photos I find online to draw from. Every once in a while, I'd have an idea for a character pose that I just couldn't find a reference for, and that's when I use my family to pose for me. I just want to show a couple of these to get a glimpse into the process, my drawing process. I take my family's pictures to draw from, but sometimes I come back in, make them take the shot from a different angle. They have no idea what's going on or why I'm taking these photos, but sometimes I make them use props. But having live-in reference models was always a big help for me in my process. But yeah, so in the same way that I use reference material for the artwork, that's the same for designing or sorry, for writing the storylines. I really wanted everything that happened to my characters to come from, real stories that I discover in interviews and stuff like that. And so, one of the biggest places, the best resources for information I found was densho.org. And so Densho is the Japanese incarceration archive based here in Seattle. And this is where I started to learn about what happened to the Japanese American community in Seattle during the war. Which was definitely a gap in my education. I learned a lot about the Holocaust in Hebrew school and public school, but the incarceration camps were not really a blip on our education. And, the main character in the story faces this dilemma. Um, you know, he's, I didn't, yeah, so he's faced with this dilemma where as a Jew, he's relying on the US as an ally against the Nazis. But at the same time, his Japanese American friends and neighbors are being forced into camps right here in America. And this is something I hadn't even thought about. And when I discovered the Densho archive, I started to learn a lot of things I hadn't heard before. And I'll just go through a couple of the statistics. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, 120,000 Japanese Americans were stripped of their rights and forced into camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. Most people lost everything, including property, possessions, businesses. 2/3 of those imprisoned were born right here in America. They were native born American citizens. And not one prisoner was ever found guilty of any crime. And when they were released, they came home to virtually nothing and had to start their lives over from scratch. But there were these rare stories of people who did reach out to help, and especially in communities where people from different backgrounds got to know each other. And so there's stories of people who rented out their neighbors' homes for them and collected rent money to pay the mortgages, like in Marco's family story. And there are stories of people, helping out by keeping businesses afloat, storing people's possessions, caretaking properties, stuff like that. So, and the more stories I heard like this, I learned about them, and I could weave them into the historical fiction narrative that I was creating. So yeah, I spent a lot of time on Densho, and researching these stories, watching video oral history archives, and pulling source material. So Densho was founded by Tom Akeda, who wanted to document and share World War II incarceration history. He conducted over 250 video oral history archives. And there's one interview that he talked about that I wanted to share with you, and that's the story of Aki Kurose. So it's a famous Seattle name here. Seattle Public Schools named a middle school after her. She's a peace activist and educator here. And in this video in 1941, she recalls being a 10th grader at Garfield High School, which is right when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And after she remembers coming to school after, the initial shock and chaos, she remembers going to school for the first time and a teacher walking up to her and saying, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." And so she talks about how threatened she felt. And before that point, she thought of herself as a normal American kid, in the community. And suddenly she was the enemy. And so this is one of the themes I wanted to address in the book. I was just asking myself, how is it possible that people's friends and neighbors, in their own communities can so quickly just change into becoming their enemies? And so, from the research and talking to people, this doesn't just happen out of the blue. The media can promote this climate of fear and misinformation. As we all know, sensational news sells, and these messages can be really powerful, to dehumanize people, groups of people. And that's why it's so rare we hear about stories of people reaching out to help. And that's another thing I wanted to highlight in the story. Yeah, and that's one thing that Densho talks about is the idea of bystanders and upstanders. The main character in this book is an upstander. He goes against what he's being told and reaches out to his friend and comes up with a plan together to figure something out. Most people however, are bystanders. They kind of just sit back and wait till things play out without taking any action. So yeah, that's another thing I wanted to kind of address and highlight. Yeah, so I worked with University of Washington and Densho, as well as For Culture, which is a local grant and funding workshop here in our organization here in Seattle, in Washington State. And I also connected with the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, which is a really great resource. Tons of other organizations helped me out. This slide is kind of funny for me because it looks like I've planned this all out, but everybody I talked to would kind of point me into a different direction to get more resources and stuff like that. I also relied on conversations with local authors, and Ken Mochizuki, actually, the author of Baseball Saved Us, ended up writing the foreword for the book, which is a really nice piece of work. Also, all the stuff I was learning is included in the back matter of the book, which I think is a great resource for anyone who wants to dive deeper into the story. And for any teachers out there, there's also an accompanying education guide, which I think is a great resource for teachers who want to include We Are Not Strangers in their curriculum. Let's see, so how much time we have here? Maybe a few more minutes. I think I'll talk about some of the kind of face-to-face conversations I have with people that added to the story. So a lot of times I talk to people and I get somebody to talk about a historical landmark that I include in the background of my book of the story. But sometimes I'd talk to people and it would turn into our conversation would turn into a whole new chapter. So one example of that is I knew I wanted to do something with the Sephardic Bechor synagogue, which was an important landmark, but I didn't know what temple was like in the 40s. But my mom asked around to one of her best friends, remembered kind of growing up and going to synagogue. And she told us about the women's section in the balcony where people would gossip and shush each other during the service. So that became kind of a setting of one of my scenes. Another example of a conversation that led to a whole new chapter. We have a family friend, Linda Suyama, who owns a Zuma gallery in Seattle, which is a great, amazing Japanese fine art gallery here. And I went to visit the gallery and talk to Linda about my project, and she brought out these Japanese woodblock prints. And the prints actually became the focal point of the scene of a father teaching his daughter about their family origins. So yeah, here's another shot of that. And one more story I wanted to talk about. I kept hearing about Link's Tackle Shop in my from people I was interviewing, and it was a Japanese American owned store in the Central District, and I wanted to do a scene here, and so I got in touch with the owners, Jerry and Maria Papoo, who were nice enough to invite me into their home, and I told them about my story and that it was about highlighting people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war, and they both kind of looked at each other and smiled. And Jerry went on to tell me the story of his dad, who was an immigrant from Japan who struggled to make a living in Seattle. But if, after a while, the store was getting popular. He was feeling stable, and one day he took his family up to ski at Snoqualmie Pass, which isn't too far from Seattle. And when they got back him and the family got back to Seattle, they found out Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And it wasn't long after that they were forced to close the shop and evacuate. And after living years of living in the camps, the family returned home, and to their surprise, a Jewish insurance agent friend of theirs had continued to pay their insurance premiums while they were gone. And when the policy matured, the family received a payout and were able to reopen Link's Tackle Shop. So this insurance agent even checked up on the shop while they were away. Yeah, there's a lot more to the story. And I was able to record it and put it on denshow.org, which is cool. But yeah, it was just a really cool moment because I went to interview these folks about their shop, and it turned into another true story that I learned about. So yeah, so in closing, this book has been out for a few months now, and I keep getting asked why I think these stories are so relevant to us today. And there's still a lot of ignorance and violence out there, in which we see in our communities here all the time, and it affects us right here in our own neighborhoods. Um, and sometimes it just feels like the cycle of conflict is just never going to end. I know I'm not the only one who's felt pretty hopeless this last few months. But these true stories of real people from different backgrounds working together, helping each other during really uncertain times, I think that's just a great example of something we could use a lot more of. And sometimes it feels like in a lot of ways we're almost encouraged to look at each other as strangers in a lot of ways. And yeah, so I just hope the stories that I've highlighted in this book can act as a reminder to people and students and just the whole community that it just doesn't have to be that way. So thank you very much for your time and for coming. I would love to answer any questions you guys have.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was an amazing presentation. Kol hakavod, on what you've done so far. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, this is your first graphic novel, right? Which it's already not even a small feat to produce a graphic novel, let alone one that's so beautiful and rich in terms of historical content. So thank you for sharing this all with us, especially with this audience who the story is very relevant, right? Because this is a Ladino, Greek, and Turkish, like you mentioned, community. So I have a couple questions, and then if anybody in the audience has questions, please write them into the chat. You can do so now or anytime throughout the rest of our Q&A for the rest of the program, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can that we have time for. So tell me, like I mentioned, this is your first graphic novel. Why a graphic novel now, right? You are an artist, you've done 2 children's books, but you really haven't done a graphic novel before, so why this now?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I don't think it was really a plan. That's why I kind of start this presentation with that story of my uncle just telling us this story over a family dinner, because that's just the first time I had heard it. And when you hear a story like that, I was just like, whoa, I've never heard anything quite like that. And my idea wasn't for it to be a graphic novel right off the bat. I thought I could do a small little comic or something I could do locally, something just to kind of get the story out. But as you can tell from that presentation, talking to Devin and then like as I just kept talking to people, the story just began to really grow. and get more important. I learned so much along the way that it eventually became what it is. So yeah, wasn't quite a plan, but it just became my first graphic novel. That's how it happened.
And now, growing up in Seattle, obviously you are Sephardic of Sephardic heritage. You are third generation Seattle Sephardi in many ways. What stories had you heard in the past just about your family's experience in general as Sephardic Jews? Because each family had a very different story. Your family being from Marmara in Turkey, some families were from Tekirdağ, some were from Istanbul, some were from the island of Rhodes. So, what can
Sure.
you tell us a little bit about your family's personal narrative?
Yeah, it was, when you grow up in that culture, for us, it was just kind of a subtle thing that was always there as a young child. I'd hear my grandparents, every once in a while they'd say, something in Ladino. It wasn't like all the time, but it was just kind of, and definitely the food was a huge part of growing up in this culture. And I think that this story and this project has just really gotten me really in touch with that culture of my origins, just growing up that way. I just kind of it was just like I said, it was just kind of in the background, and I didn't really think about it all that much. But this story has really brought that up and made me really think about that cultural history. So.
So, do you remember any kind of things that you grew up doing as a young kid, maybe connected to your Sephardic heritage, maybe some foods perhaps in the house that you always had around?
Oh yeah. So we had boyus, we had well, and balemas is what my uncle's side calls it, because they were from Turkey. My grandparents, my papa was from Greece, more that area. But yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, probably my biggest memory is like having friends over and just having all this food that we thought was just normal, and like I'd have, just friends from the neighborhood come over and they're like, "What is this food?" They always looked at it as like, "What? This is such an interesting culture," and they thought it was just very different. I was like, "This doesn't seem different at all." But yeah, definitely the food was just a huge, huge part. And actually, maybe some people will appreciate this. My papa was Sephardic, and he married an Ashkenazic. Uh, his wife was Ashkenazic, and pretty much constantly, everybody was just constantly talking about how much better the food was on the Sephardic side. It was just like a constant dialogue and poking fun at the other side. So that's kind of funny.
We all know the rule, right? Sephardim, we just have the better food, you know?
Facts.
Now, you mentioned your Papoo, your grandfather was from Greece. Can you tell us a little bit more about his personal story? You actually alluded to the fact that he was a survivor.
Yeah, he came from a really long line of rabbis, actually, and he was kind of the first one the story goes, the first one who didn't carry that tradition on. So we kind of grew up in a pretty secular, just very, not very religious family, honestly. And we went to Hebrew school, had a bar mitzvah, but he was a pretty he didn't he was kind of against talking about Judaism very much, and he just kind of wanted to put that behind him. And I don't really know why. I didn't really get a chance to talk to him too much about that, but he was still very ingrained in the cultural side of, and that's just kind of how we grew up, with like the just having the Sephardic culture as just a backdrop for our entire family, culturally and stuff like that. So, but yeah, he like, and that's a big theme about in my story, him and a lot of people, most of the people I talked about whose parents and grandparents went through hard times through the Holocaust, or even on the other side with the incarceration camp. They didn't really want to, they didn't either know that much really of anything that happened to their grandparents or parents, or, maybe just a little bit. And so that's definitely one of the themes in the story, is just kind of like the fact that, you know, these cultures, they have that in common, like protect the kids, don't talk about the past, just move forward, work hard. And, but I think it's encouraging that, like, people like me and my kids, or in my generation, they really want to learn more about those stories, because I think we can learn from them. So
And tell us a little bit, what was some of the common family names of the Sephardic side?
yeah, so there's Israel, Al Hadith, the Calvos. Um, I grew up. One of my best friends was Polakar. So those were the big names in our kind of community here. Do
And if
those
you
ring
know
a
any,
bell?
yeah, if you know anything about Seattle, those are some very big family names in the community as well, in the Seattle Sephardic community. They're very, very common as well. And they're very common in the Sephardic world, and they're very big names with long histories as well in our community.
Yeah,
It's just interesting to see all the play and the connections there as well.
yeah.
Um, so going back to the book for a second specifically, tell us what it's like to actually write a graphic novel, because I think most people who are watching today, maybe one or two have ever published a book, let alone a graphic novel. It's a little bit of a different beast in the sense that you have to deal with both a beautiful narrative story, but also a beautiful graphic presentation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I for me personally, I have a process, but I've done a few book talks with other authors, and there's all kinds of different processes of how to do it. I personally um, try to do all my writing first, and how I write is I write kind of picturing what my images are going to look like in my scenes, and write the dialogue. Just kind of have an idea of what the scene is going to be and what the storyline is going to be before I put pen to paper. But I've talked to a lot of people who just draw. They just start drawing, so there's a lot of different ways to do it. I think I plan ahead a little bit because I've gotten myself into trouble with just wasting a lot of time and energy on artwork that just needs to be scrapped because as any other writers know, editing and hacking your work is a big part of the process. So yeah, I like to plan ahead. But then yeah, and then I start storyboarding, which is just kind of laying out what the panels are and how they're going to be arranged on the page. And then I pencil my work, and then from there it's inking and color, and then yeah, that's how it goes.
I'm going to look over to the chat right now. Again, if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, please enter in the chat box. You're welcome to do so now. One question I've been seeing here is what was the reception, if there has been any, in some schools? Because you mentioned that you created a kind of a section in the book for educators and how they can educate on the ideas behind intercultural dialogue and what do people do being upcenter versus bystander. So how's the book been received in schools?
Yeah, so that's just really starting out, which I'm really, really excited to see. I'm doing it, I think my first school talk here next month. But yeah, when I've done some local speaking events, it's been really nice to have teachers come up and be excited about this because, I don't know how it is for everybody here, but for me growing up, my favorite way to learn history was through personal character driven stories where I connect with the characters and then the kind of histories in the background and I can really relate to it rather than just the fact. So I'm really excited about that opportunity. The reception's been good. I've been surprised that when I wrote this, I was like, oh, I think this will be kind of like more like a middle school through high school. But I've been getting having people reach out to me being like, oh, my fourth grader, my fifth grader really enjoyed it, and so I'm like really surprised. But that's really been neat to see.
It's amazing. Any feedback from the Seattle Sephardic community? Have they said anything about kind of telling this narrative story about narrative fiction but historical kind of, but it still encompasses their Sephardic identity? So any feedback from the community there?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the opportunity and pleasure of speaking at a few Sephardic synagogues here. I have a couple that are coming, and yeah, I mean the reception is great. I think there's so much excitement because as we all know, that it's rare to see a Sephardic story in media, pop culture, anything, especially a comic book like that. So that's been exciting, and also what's been really rewarding is at a lot of these events, I'll have people without fail, somebody comes up to me with a story about, their immigration story or their family story. And I'm just like, man, that could be a graphic novel right there. Right. So, yeah, I think that there's just so much opportunity for these stories to just kind of keep emerging and be told.
What's next? What are you working on next for your work in terms of either Sephardic related content or otherwise?
Yeah, like as you can tell, when I first heard this story for this project about 4 years ago, so it took quite a while to get this thing off the ground. And it's pretty painstaking. So I'm kind of hesitating. I am absorbing a lot of different stories and thinking about what that might be. I am also working on some fiction work and some other personal stories. So I definitely want to do something else, and I'm in the process of honestly just doing too much. I have to just kind of figure out which one to land on. So
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I want to say to
okay.
Josh, thank you so very much. This is incredible. I also want to mention that you can buy this wonderful new book, We Are Not Strangers, wherever books are sold. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it in your local bookstore or online. So please, you can check it out anywhere. Again, We Are Not Strangers. This is a brand new graphic novel. Josh, thank you again so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and yeah, really appreciate you setting this up and making the time for it.
Our pleasure. Again, and thank you all so much for joining us. If you missed any part of the program, you can always check on YouTube at youtube.com/Sephardic Brotherhood. Thank you all so much again.